Normandy, France, August 7, 1944, 1300 hours, and SS-Obersturmbannführer Wilhelm Tychsen, commanding the remnants of the 2nd SS Panzer Division das Reich, watched his column of 43 tanks grinding westward along the narrow road toward Mortain, completely unaware that RAF squadron leader Dennis Crowley-Milling was already calling in the coordinates to 6 squadrons of rocket-armed Hawker Typhoons circling at 10,000 feet above, their pilots eager to unleash what they called the most devastating ground attack weapon of the entire war. The steel column stretched for nearly 2 kilometers along the D-177 road, Mark IV Panzers and Panthers intermixed with half-tracks, fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and field ambulances, all advancing in broad daylight because German High Command had assured them the Luftwaffe would provide air cover for Operation Lüttich, Hitler's desperate counteroffensive to split the American forces and drive them back into the sea. But Tychsen hadn't seen a single German fighter all morning, only the constant circling of what his men called Jabos, the fighter-bombers that had plagued them since D-Day, though none had yet attacked with the ferocity that was about to descend upon them in the next 3 minutes. The Typhoon pilots above were flying what the RAF called cab rank patrols, a system where squadrons orbited over the battlefield waiting to be directed onto targets by forward air controllers embedded with ground forces, and Flight Lieutenant John Golly of 245 Squadron had been circling for 20 minutes when the call came through his headset that a massive German armored column was moving in the open near Mortain, presenting what Wing Commander Charles Green had briefed them about that morning as the moment we have all been waiting for, gentlemen, the chance of getting at Panzer tanks out in the open, and there are lots of the bastards. The RP-3 rockets hanging beneath each Typhoon's wings were 3-inch diameter projectiles weighing 60 pounds each, with semi-armor-piercing warheads that could penetrate up to 7 inches of armor plate, and each aircraft carried 8 of these weapons, for under each wing, creating a combined firepower that the pilots liked to boast was equivalent to a naval destroyer's broadside, though few of the German tank crews below had any conception of what was about to hit them. Tychsen had fought in Russia where the Luftwaffe had maintained air superiority until 1943, and even when Soviet Sturmovix began appearing in greater numbers, they carried small bombs and cannons that could damage but rarely destroyed a well-armored Panzer. So when his radioman reported Allied aircraft overhead, the SS officer wasn't particularly concerned, ordering his column to maintain speed and continue toward their objective at St. Barthélemy, where they were to link up with the 1st SS Panzer Division and push through to Avranches, cutting off Patton's Third Army from its supply lines. The German tanks were moving at 20 kilometers per hour, maintaining proper spacing of 50 meters between vehicles as prescribed by Wehrmacht doctrine, their commanders standing in open turrets scanning for American positions, while machine gunners manned the vehicle-mounted MG-34s and MG-42s, ready to spray any hedgerow that might conceal enemy infantry, but none of them were looking up at the right angle to see the first pair of Typhoons rolling into their attack dive. Flight Lieutenant Golly pushed his control stick forward and felt his stomach rise as the Typhoon nosed over into a 40-degree dive, the speedometer climbing past 300, then 400 miles per hour as he lined up on the lead Panzer in his reflector gun sight, waiting until the range closed to less than 1,000 yards before squeezing the firing button that sent the first pair of RP-3 rockets screaming from beneath his wings, followed immediately by the second pair. Then the third and fourth in rapid succession, the whole salvo launched in less than 2 seconds before he hauled back on the stick to pull out of the dive, his aircraft groaning under the G-forces as the rockets streaked toward their targets at 850 feet per second. The psychological effect on the German crews was instantaneous and devastating, as SS Unterscharfer Werner Jossipite, commanding a Mark IV in the middle of the column, later described, "We saw 2 black dots in the sky and that always meant rockets. Then the rockets would hit the tanks which would burn, and the soldiers would come out all burnt and screaming with pain," though his description barely captured the chaos that erupted when Golly's rockets found their mark. The first RP-3 struck Tychsen's command Panther just behind the turret ring, the 60-pound warhead detonating with enough force to lift the 25-ton turret completely off the hull and flip it onto the roadside, instantly killing the crew of 5, while the second rocket hit an ammunition truck that disappeared in a thunderous explosion, sending burning debris across 300 meters, igniting the wheat fields on both sides of the road and creating a curtain of black smoke that obscured the vision of the following vehicles, who began firing their machine guns wildly into the air without any hope of hitting the fast-moving Typhoons that were already climbing away to make room for the next pair of aircraft diving on the column. The German tank crews had trained for months on how to defend against enemy tanks, how to use terrain for cover, how to coordinate their movements with infantry support, but nothing in their training manuals addressed how to defend against aircraft that could appear without warning, deliver devastating firepower in seconds, and disappear before anti-aircraft guns could even traverse to track them, leaving the proud Panzer divisions as helpless as if they were horse-drawn wagons from an earlier century. The second pair of Typhoons was already rolling in as Gali pulled up, and SS-Sturmbannführer Christian Bachmann, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the Das Reich Panzer Regiment, screamed into his radio for all vehicles to disperse into the fields. But the narrow road was bordered by steep ditches and thick Norman hedgerows that trapped the column like rats in a maze, forcing them to abandon vehicles and run for cover as more rockets slammed into the packed formation, each impact creating a kill zone of 30 meters where shrapnel and blast effects could destroy soft-skin vehicles and kill exposed crew members. The RP-3 rockets had been developed specifically for attacking German armor after earlier weapons proved ineffective against the thick frontal armor of Tigers and Panthers, and the solution had been to increase the warhead weight to 60 pounds of high explosive, creating a weapon that could flip a 45-ton Panther onto its side or blow the tracks off a Tiger tank, rendering it immobile and vulnerable to follow-up attacks, though the psychological impact proved even more devastating than the physical damage. Within 10 minutes, 6 squadrons of Typhoons had made their attack runs on the Das Reich column, firing over 200 RP-3 rockets that left 17 tanks burning, 23 other vehicles destroyed, and over 200 casualties among the Panzer Grenadiers who had been riding on the half-tracks and trucks. But more importantly, the attack had completely shattered the momentum of the German counteroffensive, forcing the survivors to abandon the daylight advance and seek cover in woods and villages where they would remain hidden until nightfall, losing precious hours that allowed American forces to reinforce their positions and call in even more air support. General der Panzertruppe Hans Freiherr von Funk, commanding 47th Panzer Corps, reported to Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge that evening. The attack has been brought to a standstill due to the employment of fighter bombers by the enemy and the absence of our own air support, a message that Kluge reluctantly forwarded to Hitler's headquarters, where the Führer raged about Luftwaffe incompetence but refused to accept that the age of Panzer supremacy had ended. The Typhoon pilots returned to their forward airfields at B2 Bazenville and B3 St. Croix-sur-Mer, where ground crews immediately began refueling and rearming the aircraft with fresh rockets, a process that took less than 30 minutes, allowing the same squadrons to fly 3 or 4 missions per day, maintaining what they called continuous cab rank coverage over the battlefield from dawn to dusk, a system that meant German forces could never know when the next attack might come. Squadron leader Desmond Scott of 486 Squadron, a New Zealander who had flown over 200 combat missions, described the scene over Mortain that afternoon. The road was crammed with enemy vehicles, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, even horse-drawn wagons and ambulances, nose to tail, all in a frantic bid to reach cover. And as I sped to the head of this mile-long column, hundreds of German troops began spilling out into the road to sprint for the open fields and hedgerows. But there was no escape. Typhoons were already attacking in deadly swoops at the other end of the column, and within seconds the whole stretch of road was bursting and blazing under streams of rocket and cannon fire. The Germans had encountered rocket-firing aircraft on the Eastern Front, where Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix carried RS-82 and RS-132 rockets, but these weapons were inaccurate and relatively weak, with warheads of only 8 to 23 pounds that could damage light vehicles but rarely penetrated tank armor, so Wehrmacht commanders had developed tactics to minimize losses, ordering tanks to maintain wide spacing, using anti-aircraft guns for protection, and coordinating with their own fighters for air cover, tactics that had worked reasonably well until 1943. The Western Allies had taken a completely different approach, developing the RP-3 rocket with a much larger warhead and training pilots to attack in coordinated strikes that overwhelmed defenses, while the cab rank system meant that ground forces could call in air support within minutes of spotting enemy targets, creating a level of tactical integration between air and ground forces that the Germans had never achieved even at the height of their Blitzkrieg victories. SS-Obersturmbannführer Horst Weber of Kampfgruppe Nost, who survived the Normandy campaign only to spend 5 years in Allied captivity, later provided one of the most detailed German accounts of facing Typhoon rocket attacks. "We had 4 Tiger tanks and 3 Panther tanks near Puto and Bessin. We were convinced that we would gain another victory here, that we would smash the enemy forces because our tanks were superior to their Shermans, but then Typhoons dropped these rockets on our tanks and shot all 7 to bits, and we cried. Yes, we veteran SS soldiers actually cried because we were completely helpless. We could do nothing except watch our beautiful Tigers burn while our comrades screamed inside them. Weber's account captured the psychological trauma that rocket attacks inflicted on German tank crews, who had been taught since training that their Panzers were the finest weapons in the world, only to discover they were defenseless against an enemy they couldn't even effectively engage. The development of the RP-3 rocket had begun in 1943 when RAF analysts studied the failure of earlier anti-tank weapons and concluded that hitting a moving tank with a bomb required exceptional skill and luck, while cannon fire from fighter aircraft rarely penetrated the increasingly thick armor of German tanks, leading to the decision to adapt the Royal Navy's 3-inch anti-aircraft rocket for air-to-ground use. The initial versions used a 25-pound armor-piercing warhead, but combat experience in Italy showed these were ineffective against Tiger tanks, so the design was modified to use a 60-pound semi-armor-piercing warhead with a delayed action fuse that allowed the rocket to penetrate armor before detonating, creating devastating internal damage that could instantly kill an entire crew, though pilots discovered that even near misses could flip lighter vehicles or blow tracks off tanks, achieving a mission kill that was just as effective as complete destruction. The Hawker Typhoon itself had been a disappointment when first introduced in 1941, suffering from engine problems, carbon monoxide leaks into the cockpit, and structural failures that killed several pilots, leading to calls for its cancellation until someone discovered it was the only RAF fighter that could catch the Focke-Wulf 190 at low altitude, giving it a new lease on life as a low-level interceptor and eventually as the premier ground attack aircraft of the 2nd Tactical Air Force. By D-Day, the RAF had 26 operational Typhoon squadrons, with pilots who had trained intensively in rocket firing techniques at ranges in Scotland and Wales, where they practiced diving attacks against tank hulks and learned to judge the complex ballistics of the unguided rockets, which dropped significantly in flight and required pilots to aim well above their targets, a skill that took weeks to master but produced devastating results in combat. The morning of August 8, 1944, brought even worse news for German commanders when American forces of the 15th Corps captured Le Mans, threatening to encircle the entire German 7th Army in what would become known as the Falaise Pocket, while to the north, the 1st Canadian Army launched Operation Lüttich, an offensive toward Falaise that threatened to close the only escape route for hundreds of thousands of German troops. Yet Hitler insisted that Operation Lüttich continue, ordering the 9th Panzer Division transferred from opposing Patton's advance to join the Mortain attack, a decision that Field Marshal von Kluge knew was suicidal but dared not oppose. The Luftwaffe had promised to provide 500 fighters to cover the offensive, but when the appointed hour came, less than 30 aircraft appeared, and these were immediately bounced by American P-51 Mustangs and British Spitfires, never even reaching the battlefield where German tanks sat exposed and vulnerable to the constant attacks by rocket-firing Typhoons that seemed to appear every time a column tried to move. General Major Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, had fought in Poland, France, and Russia, earning the Knight's Cross with oak leaves for his tactical brilliance. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the intensity of Allied air attacks in Normandy. Writing in his after-action report, the enemy's fighter-bombers patrol the battlefield continuously in groups of 6 to 12 aircraft, attacking everything that moves with rockets and cannon fire. They appear within minutes of any movement being detected, making it impossible to conduct offensive operations during daylight hours, and our own fighter protection is completely absent, leaving us defenseless against these attacks which have reduced my division to less than 30 operational tanks from the 120 we possessed on June 6. His report, like dozens of others from German commanders, painted a picture of an army paralyzed by air power, unable to move, unable to mass for attacks, unable even to bring up supplies and reinforcements except under cover of darkness. The British had refined their cab rank system through painful experience in North Africa and Italy, where lack of coordination between air and ground forces had led to friendly fire incidents and missed opportunities. But by 1944, they had developed a sophisticated system where forward air controllers equipped with VHF radios traveled in tanks or universal carriers just behind the front lines, able to communicate directly with circling aircraft and bring them onto targets within minutes. Wing Commander Roland Beaumont, who commanded a Typhoon wing during the Normandy campaign, explained the system. We would maintain 4 aircraft over the battlefield at all times during daylight hours, circling at 10,000 feet where we could see for miles in every direction, and when the controller called in a target, we could be making our attack run within 2 minutes, while another flight was already taking off from base to replace us, ensuring continuous coverage that gave the Germans no respite. The psychological impact of the rocket attacks extended far beyond the immediate casualties they inflicted, as German soldiers developed what medical officers called Jabo neurosis, a condition similar to shell shock where men would freeze or panic at the sound of aircraft engines, even when the planes were merely passing overhead without attacking, and tank crews began refusing to move during daylight, preferring court-martial to certain death under the rockets of the Typhoons. SS-Obersturmbannführer Karl Kloskowski of the 12th Hitlerjugend Division reported. My young soldiers, boys of 17 and 18 who had been eager for combat, became nervous wrecks after a week of constant air attacks. They would not leave their foxholes even to relieve themselves, and when ordered to advance, some would simply sit down and cry, broken by the terror of the rockets that could appear at any moment without warning. On August 13, 1944, as German forces desperately tried to escape the closing Falaise pocket, the weather cleared after several days of rain and low clouds that had grounded most aircraft, allowing the 2nd Tactical Air Force and the U.S. 9th Air Force to launch what became known as the Great Shoot. With over 3,000 sorties flown against the packed roads where German columns stretched for miles in desperate attempts to reach safety before the gap closed. Flight Lieutenant William Simpson of 193 Squadron described the scene. It was the most incredible target I ever saw. The entire road from Falaise to Argenton was packed with German transport, tanks, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, ambulances, staff cars, everything you could imagine, all jammed together and barely moving, and we just flew up and down the column firing rockets and cannon until we ran out of ammunition. Then returned to base to rearm and went back for more. It was like a turkey shoot. The RP-3 rocket's 60-pound warhead contained a mixture of RDX and TNT that created a blast effect capable of overturning a 30-ton tank or completely destroying soft-skin vehicles within a radius of 20 meters, while the semi-armor piercing casing could penetrate up to 198 millimeters of armor at any range, making even the frontal armor of Tiger tanks vulnerable to a direct hit, though pilots discovered that attacking from the side or rear was far more effective, as the thinner armor there could be penetrated more easily and hits on the engine compartment would set tanks ablaze. The rockets traveled at 260 meters per second, reaching their targets in less than 4 seconds from release, giving enemy gunners no time to react, while the distinctive whooshing sound they made in flight became a terror weapon in itself, causing panic among German troops who learned to associate that sound with imminent death. Oberst Hermann von Appeln-Bronikowski, commanding the Panzer Regiment of the 21st Panzer Division, had been personally told by General Erich Marx on D-Day that, whether the invasion is defeated or not depends on you. If you don't succeed in throwing the British into the sea, we shall have lost the war. But by August his regiment had been reduced to fewer than 10 operational tanks, most lost to air attacks rather than ground combat, leading him to write, "The enemy's mastery of the air has become the decisive factor in this campaign. Their rocket-firing aircraft can appear anywhere at any time, striking with devastating effect before we can react, and we have no effective countermeasures. Our anti-aircraft guns cannot elevate quickly enough to track them, and our own fighters are completely absent from the battlefield." The Italian campaign had provided a testing ground for the RP-3 rocket, where Typhoons of the Desert Air Force had first used them against German positions in the Gothic Line, but the mountainous terrain of Italy limited their effectiveness, as tanks could find cover more easily and the narrow valleys restricted attack angles, whereas the relatively open countryside of Normandy, with its long straight roads and broad fields, provided ideal conditions for rocket attacks. Wing Commander David Shannon, who had commanded a Typhoon squadron in both theaters, noted the difference. In Italy we might spend an hour searching for targets hidden in mountain valleys, getting only 1 or 2 attack runs before fuel forced us home, but in Normandy, especially during the Falaise battle, we could hardly miss. Every road was packed with German vehicles trying to escape, and we could make multiple attacks on each sortie, limited only by our ammunition. By August 15, 1944, the Falaise gap had narrowed to less than 10 kilometers, with Canadian forces pushing south from Falaise while American and Free French forces advanced north from Argenton, creating a bottleneck through which the entire German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were trying to escape, their columns subjected to continuous air attack from dawn to dusk as weather conditions remained perfect for flying. The roads became littered with destroyed vehicles and dead horses, the Wehrmacht still relying heavily on horse-drawn transport for artillery and supplies, creating obstacles that further slowed the retreat and made following vehicles even more vulnerable to air attack. while the smell of death became so overwhelming that pilots reported being able to smell it at 3,000 feet altitude. SS Gruppenführer Werner Ostendorf, commanding the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, attempted to organize a counterattack to keep the gap open, assembling what remained of 4 panzer divisions for a desperate thrust against Polish positions on Hill 262. But as his tanks emerged from cover near Vimoutiers on the morning of August 19, they were immediately spotted by reconnaissance aircraft and within minutes came under attack from 3 squadrons of Typhoons that destroyed 11 tanks in the first strike. Alone, forcing Ostendorf to abandon the attack and order his surviving vehicles to disperse and attempt escape individually. The Polish defenders on Hill 262, who had been fighting desperately against German attempts to break through, watched in amazement as the Typhoons systematically destroyed the attacking force, with one Polish officer commenting, "The rockets came down like the wrath of God, turning proud tigers into burning coffins, and we could see German crews abandoning undamaged tanks in panic, running across open fields where our machine guns cut them down." The technical specifications of the RP-3 rocket represented a significant advance over earlier weapons, with a 3-inch diameter motor tube containing 11.5 pounds of cordite propellant that accelerated the projectile to maximum velocity within 50 feet of launch, while 4 large tail fins provided stability in flight, though the weapon remained unguided and accuracy depended entirely on pilot skill and experience, with even veteran pilots achieving direct hits on tank-sized targets only about 4% of the time. However, the rockets were typically fired in salvos of 8, and the blast effect of near misses could still disable vehicles by destroying tracks, optics, or external equipment, while the psychological impact of a salvo of 8 60-pound warheads exploding around a tank was devastating to crew morale, often causing them to abandon their vehicles even when damage was minimal. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, who replaced von Kluge as Commander-in-Chief West on August 17, immediately recognized the hopelessness of the situation and ordered a general retreat, ignoring Hitler's demands to stand and fight. But even his tactical genius couldn't overcome the reality of attempting to move hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles through a gap barely 6 kilometers wide under constant air attack. Model himself came under rocket attack on August 20th when his staff car convoy was spotted by Typhoons near Chambois, forcing the field marshal to abandon his vehicle and take cover in a ditch while his aide-de-camp and driver were killed, an experience that led him to comment bitterly, "We are attempting to conduct a modern war with medieval means. Our enemy owns the sky, and we cannot move a company without attracting swarms of these rocket-firing devils." The Luftwaffe's absence from the Normandy battlefield represented one of the greatest failures in German military history, as the once mighty force that had terrorized Europe in 1940 had been reduced to impotence by years of attrition, poor strategic decisions, and the overwhelming industrial might of the Allies, who by 1944 were producing more aircraft in a month than Germany could in a year. General Lieutenant Joseph Beppo Schmid, commanding the I Fighter Corps responsible for air defense of France, reported that he had only 150 operational fighters to face over 3,000 Allied aircraft, and most of his pilots were inexperienced replacements with less than 50 hours of combat training, compared to Allied pilots who typically had over 200 hours before entering combat, making any attempt at contesting air superiority suicidal. The morning of August 21, 1944, marked the official closing of the Falaise Gap when Canadian and Polish forces finally linked up at Chambois, trapping approximately 50,000 German soldiers in a pocket roughly 20 kilometers long and 10 kilometers wide. Though perhaps another 50,000 had managed to escape in the preceding days, most abandoning their heavy equipment and vehicles to flee on foot through woods and along secondary roads at night when the Typhoons couldn't operate. General der Panzertruppe Heinrich Eberbach, who had assumed command of the 5th Panzer Army after Dietrich was wounded, surrendered on August 31 with the remnants of his command, later stating, "The rocket-firing Typhoons were the most terrible weapon we faced in Normandy. They appeared without warning, struck with devastating power, and disappeared before we could respond. They made movement impossible, resupply hazardous, and concentration of forces suicidal. They were more responsible for our defeat than any other single weapon." Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited the Falaise battlefield on August 23, walking through what he described as unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas, where it was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh, a scene of devastation that shocked even veteran soldiers who had seen the worst of modern warfare. The destruction was so complete that bulldozers had to be brought in to clear paths through the wreckage, pushing aside burned-out tanks, overturned trucks, and bloated corpses of horses and men, while grave registration units worked for weeks to bury the dead, eventually giving up on individual identification and creating mass graves for thousands of German soldiers whose bodies were too badly burned or decomposed to identify. The RP-3 rocket had proven itself as one of the most effective weapons of the Normandy campaign, not so much for the actual damage it inflicted, which post-war analysis showed was less than claimed at the time, but for its psychological impact on German forces who learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of the Typhoon and the whooshing sound of incoming rockets more than almost any other weapon. Statistics compiled after the battle showed that of approximately 1,500 German tanks lost in Normandy, less than 100 were destroyed by air attack, but this number failed to account for the hundreds of tanks abandoned by their crews under air attack, the countless operations cancelled due to fear of air attack, and the paralysis that gripped German forces when they lost the ability to move during daylight hours. Wing Commander John Robert Baldwin, who commanded 146 Wing during the Normandy campaign and became the highest-scoring Typhoon ace with 15 aerial victories in addition to his ground attack missions, summarized the impact of the rocket-armed Typhoon. "We didn't win the Battle of Normandy by destroying every German tank with rockets. The statistics show we actually hit very few, but we made it impossible for them to fight the way they wanted to fight. We forced them to hide during the day. We disrupted their communications. We destroyed their supply columns. We shattered their morale, and most importantly, we made them realize they could no longer win through superior tactics or training because we owned the sky above them." His assessment was echoed by German commanders who survived the campaign, many of whom identified Allied air superiority, and particularly the rocket-firing Typhoons, as the decisive factor in their defeat. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division, which had entered combat on June 7 with over 20,000 men and 150 tanks, emerged from the Falaise pocket with fewer than 300 men and no vehicles, having lost 94% of its armor and almost all its artillery to a combination of ground combat and air attacks, with survivors describing the rocket attacks as particularly demoralizing because they felt so helpless against them. SS-Sturmbannführer Hubert Meyer, who served as the division's operations officer, wrote in his post-war memoir, "The rocket-firing Typhoons broke our spirit more than any other weapon. When we heard that distinctive engine sound approaching, grown men would pray, boys would cry, and everyone would try to find whatever cover they could, knowing that in seconds death could come from the sky without warning or mercy." The Japanese military, observing the European war through their attaches in Berlin and reports from German advisors, took note of the devastating effectiveness of Allied fighter bombers and tried to develop countermeasures for the expected invasion of Japan. But their analysis concluded that without air superiority, ground forces were helpless against rocket and bomb attacks, contributing to the decision to adopt kamikaze tactics as their conventional forces could no longer compete with American air power. Vice Admiral Matomagaki, who commanded the Imperial Japanese Navy's kamikaze operations, wrote in his diary, "The German experience in France proves that conventional ground forces cannot operate under enemy air supremacy. Their magnificent Panzer divisions were reduced to scrap metal by enemy aircraft, and we face the same fate unless we adopt extraordinary measures, though even suicide attacks ultimately proved insufficient against overwhelming Allied material superiority." The Italian forces who had faced Allied fighter bombers in Sicily and southern Italy had experienced similar devastation, with survivors describing the psychological trauma of constant air attacks that made movement impossible and turned every daylight hour into a test of nerves, leading to widespread desertion and the rapid collapse of Italian resistance after the fall of Mussolini. General d'Armata Mario Roata, who commanded the Italian Sixth Army in Sicily, reported, "The enemy's fighter bombers, particularly those firing rockets, created panic among our troops who had no experience of such weapons and no effective defense against them. Entire battalions would dissolve when attacked, with soldiers throwing away their weapons and fleeing in terror, making organized resistance impossible." General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the architect of German Blitzkrieg tactics who had been recalled from retirement to serve as Inspector General of Panzer forces, visited Normandy in July 1944 and was shocked by what he found, writing in his report to Hitler, "The Panzer divisions that conquered France in 1940 moved freely under the protection of our own air superiority, but now our tanks must hide like rats during daylight, emerging only at night to move short distances before seeking cover again at dawn. This is not warfare as we understand it, This is slow strangulation by an enemy who has mastered the integration of air and ground forces to a degree we never achieved. His report was suppressed by Hitler, who refused to accept that the Wehrmacht could no longer conduct offensive operations in the face of Allied air power. The development of the cab rank system represented a revolution in close air support that wouldn't be fully appreciated until after the war, when military theorists recognized that the ability to deliver devastating firepower within minutes of target identification had fundamentally changed the nature of ground combat, making concentration of forces extremely hazardous and forcing armies to disperse, reducing their combat effectiveness. Air Marshal Arthur Coningham, who commanded the 2nd Tactical Air Force, had pioneered the system in North Africa and perfected it in Normandy, creating a level of air-ground cooperation that the Germans, despite their early successes with dive bombers in Poland and France, never achieved, partly due to inter-service rivalry between the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht that prevented effective coordination. On August 25, 1944, Paris was liberated by Allied forces, marking the symbolic end of German occupation of France, though fighting would continue for another 9 months before final victory in Europe. But for the German soldiers who had survived the Normandy campaign, the war was effectively lost. Their faith in ultimate victory shattered along with their faith in the superiority of German arms and tactics. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding the Panzer Lehr Division, which had been virtually annihilated in Normandy, told his American captors, "Your rocket-firing Typhoons were the angels of death for German armor. We who had been taught that the Panzer was the ultimate weapon discovered we were as vulnerable as Polish cavalry had been to our dive bombers in 1939. It was a bitter lesson in the evolution of warfare." The impact of the Typhoon and its RP-3 rockets extended beyond the immediate battlefield, as German industrial production was forced to shift from offensive weapons like tanks to defensive systems like anti-aircraft guns and fighter aircraft, neither of which could be produced in sufficient quantities to counter Allied numerical superiority, while the need to move only at night and maintain elaborate camouflage reduced German operational efficiency to a fraction of what it had been in earlier campaigns. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, calculated that the disruption caused by Allied air attacks, including the rocket-firing Typhoons, reduced German military effectiveness in France by at least 60%, making it impossible to conduct the kind of mobile warfare that had brought victory in 1940. The RP-3 rocket continued to be used throughout the remainder of the European war, with Typhoons supporting the Allied advance through Belgium and Holland, attacking German positions during the Battle of the Bulge, and supporting the Rhine crossings in 1945, though never again would they find such concentrated targets as during the Falaise battle, which remained the high watermark of rocket effectiveness in World War II. Post-war analysis showed that while actual tank kills by rockets were relatively rare, the weapon's ability to disrupt enemy operations, destroy soft-skinned vehicles, demoralize troops, and force armies to abandon daylight movement made it one of the most important tactical innovations of the war, proving that air power had evolved from a supporting role to a decisive factor in ground combat. Squadron leader Pierre Clostermann, the French ace who flew Typhoons with 602 Squadron, wrote in his memoir about attacking German columns during the Falaise battle. The Germans were magnificent soldiers, brave, disciplined, and skillful, but they were helpless against our rockets. I saw Tigers and Panthers, the finest tanks in the world, abandoned by their crews who preferred to face court-martial rather than stay in those steel coffins when they heard our engines approaching, and I felt no joy in this slaughter, only pity for brave men caught in a battle they could not win because we controlled the sky above them. His sentiment was shared by many Allied pilots who recognized that their technological advantage, rather than superior courage or skill, had determined the outcome of the battle. The German attempt to counter the rocket threat included various expedient measures such as mounting additional anti-aircraft guns on tanks, creating dummy vehicles to draw attacks away from real targets, and even experimenting with smoke generators to obscure battlefield visibility, but none proved effective against the combination of fighter-bomber speed, rocket firepower, and the cab rank system that ensured continuous battlefield coverage. SS-Obersturmbannführer Johann Paper, who commanded a battle group in the 1st SS Leibstandard Adolf Hitler Division, complained, "We tried everything to defend against the Typhoons. We put logs on our tanks to simulate gun barrels pointing upward to deter attack. We painted vehicles to look destroyed. We even tried moving single vehicles at irregular intervals to avoid creating attractive targets. But nothing worked. The rockets always found us." The psychological impact of the rocket attacks persisted long after the war, with German veterans describing nightmares about the sound of Typhoon engines and the whoosh of incoming rockets. symptoms that modern psychiatrists would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder but which at the time were dismissed as weakness or cowardice, leading to numerous executions of German soldiers who broke under the strain of constant air attack. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a Wehrmacht medical officer who treated casualties during the Normandy campaign, reported, "I saw more psychological casualties from air attacks than from ground combat. Strong men reduced to trembling wrecks by the constant fear of rockets that could strike without warning, and unlike shell shock from artillery which we knew how to treat, this aerial terror seemed to break something fundamental in men's spirits that never fully healed." The British pilots who flew the Typhoons paid a heavy price for their success, with 666 aircraft lost during the Normandy campaign, the highest loss rate of any RAF aircraft type, as flying low and straight during rocket attacks made them vulnerable to ground fire, while the Typhoon's liquid-cooled engine was particularly susceptible to damage from small arms fire that could puncture the cooling system and force the pilot to bail out over enemy territory. Flight Sergeant James Edwards of 181 Squadron, who was shot down near Cannes but evaded capture and returned to his unit, described the hazards. "The Germans learned to concentrate their flak at the point where we had to commit to our attack run, about 2,000 feet altitude and 1,000 yards from target, creating a wall of tracer and explosions we had to fly through, and many good men didn't make it through that wall, but we kept attacking because we knew our rockets were winning the battle on the ground." The legacy of the RP-3 rocket and the Typhoon fighter bomber would influence military aviation development for decades after World War II, with every major power developing specialized ground attack aircraft armed with rockets and guided missiles. Recognizing that the ability to deliver precision firepower in close support of ground forces had become essential to modern warfare, though nothing would quite match the shock effect of those first rocket attacks in Normandy when German soldiers discovered their vaunted Panzers were vulnerable to destruction from above. Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, Eisenhower's Deputy Supreme Commander, wrote in his post-war analysis, "The rocket-firing Typhoon proved that air power had matured from an auxiliary arm to a decisive factor in ground warfare. The Germans in Normandy were not defeated simply by being outfought on the ground. They were defeated because they lost control of the air above the battlefield, and once that control was lost, no amount of tactical skill or courage could save them from destruction." By late August 1944, the German forces that had entered the Normandy campaign with 800,000 men and over 2,000 tanks had been reduced to scattered remnants fleeing eastward toward the German border, leaving behind over 200,000 prisoners and untold thousands of dead, their equipment destroyed or abandoned across the French countryside in what historians would later call one of the greatest military disasters in German history, a defeat made possible by Allied air superiority and particularly by the rocket-firing Typhoons that had made daylight movement suicidal. General der Infanterie Gunther Blumentritt, who served as Chief of Staff to both Rundstedt and Model during the campaign, concluded his post-war assessment with these words, "We did not lose in Normandy because we were outgeneraled or outfought. We lost because we could not move, could not concentrate, could not even supply our forces properly due to the constant presence of enemy aircraft, particularly those terrible rocket-firing Typhoons that appeared whenever we tried to conduct operations. They paralyzed us, demoralized us, and ultimately destroyed us as an effective fighting force." The final statistics of the Normandy campaign revealed the true impact of the rocket-firing Typhoons and their Allied counterparts. While only about 7% of German tanks were confirmed destroyed by air attack, over 60% of German soft-skinned vehicles, including vital fuel trucks, ammunition carriers, and command vehicles, were destroyed from the air, crippling German logistics and command capabilities, while the psychological impact reduced German operational effectiveness by at least half according to post-war studies conducted by both Allied and German analysts. The RP-3 rocket had proven that relatively simple, unguided weapons could achieve strategic effects far beyond their tactical impact, a lesson that would influence military thinking throughout the Cold War and beyond, as nations recognized that control of the air had become prerequisite to success on the ground.